Okay, here we are. We finished books 1 and 2, and now we're just going to start the Voyage of the Dawn Treader. The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. Are you ready for it? Okay, chapter 1 is called The Picture in the Bedroom. There was a boy called Eustace Clarence Scrubb, and he almost deserved that name. His parents called him Eustace Clarence, and his schoolmasters called him Scrubb. And I can't tell you how his friends spoke to him because he didn't have any. He didn't call his father and mother father and mother. He called them Harold and Alberta. They were very up-to-date and advanced people. They were vegetarians, non-smokers, and teetotalers, and wore a special kind of underclothes. In their house, there was very little furniture, and very few clothes on the beds, and the windows were always open. Eustace Clarence liked animals, especially beetles, if they were dead and pinned on a card, that is. He liked books if they were books of information and had pictures of grain elevators or of fat foreign children doing exercises in model schools. Eustace Clarence didn't like his cousins, the 4 Pevensies, Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy. Those were his cousins. But he was quite glad when he heard that Edmund and Lucy were coming to stay, for deep down inside, he kind of liked bossying and bullying, and even though he was a puny little person who couldn't have stood up even to Lucy, let alone Edmund, in a fight, he knew that there were dozens of ways to give people a bad time if you are in your own home and they are only visitors. Who likes bullies, people that pick on other people? We don't like those kind of people, do we? Edmund and Lucy did not at all want to come and stay with Uncle Harold and Auntie Albert, but it really couldn't be helped. Father had gotten a job lecturing in America for 16 weeks that summer, and Mother was supposed to go with him because she hadn't had a real holiday for 10 years. Peter was working very hard for an exam, and he was supposed to spend the holidays being coached by old Professor Kirk, in whose house these 4 children had had wonderful adventures long ago during the war years. That would have been book 1. If he had still been in that house, he would have had them all stay, but he had somehow become poor since the old days, and he was now living in a very small cottage with only 1 bedroom to spare. And it would have cost too much money to take the other 3 all to America, and Susan had gone. Grown-ups thought her the pretty one of the family, and she was no good at schoolwork, although otherwise very old for her age, and Mother had said that she would get far more out of the trip to America than the youngsters would. Edmund and Lucy tried not to begrudge Susan her luck, but it was dreadful having to spend the summer holidays at their aunt's place. "But it's far worse for me," said Edmund, "because you'll at least have a room of your own, and I'll have to share a bedroom with that record stinker Eustace." So the story begins on an afternoon when Edmund and Lucy were stealing a few precious minutes alone together. And of course, they were talking about Narnia, which was the name of their own private and secret country. Most of us, I suppose, have a secret country, but for us it is only an imaginary country. Edmund and Lucy were luckier than other people in that respect. Their secret country was real. They had already visited it twice, not in a game, not in a dream, but in reality. They had got there, of course, by magic, which is the only way of getting to Narnia, and a promise, or very nearly a promise, had been made them in Narnia itself that they would someday get back. So you can imagine that they talked about it a good deal whenever they got the chance. They were in Lucy's room, sitting on the edge of her bed and looking at a picture on the opposite wall. It was the only picture in the house that they liked. Aunt Alberta didn't like it at all. That was why she put it away in the little back bedroom upstairs, but she couldn't get rid of it because it had been a wedding present from someone she didn't want to offend. It was a picture of a ship sailing nearly straight towards you. Her prow, the very front of the boat, was gilded and shaped like the head of a dragon with wide open mouth. She had only 1 mast and 1 large square sail, which was a rich purple. The sides of the ship, what you could see of them, where the gilded wings of the dragon ended, were green. She had just run up to the top of one glorious blue wave, and the nearer slope of that wave came down towards you with streaks and bubbles on it. She was obviously running fast before a very fresh wind, listing over a little on her port side. And by the way, if you're going to read this story at all, and if you don't know already, you would better get it into your head that the left side of a ship, when you are looking ahead, is port, and the right side is starboard. So the word left has 4 letters, and so does the word port. So that's one way to remember. So the left is the port. All the sunlight fell on her from that side, and the water on that side was full of greens and purples. On the other side, it was darker blue from the shadow of the ship. The question is, said Edmund as he stared at the picture, whether it doesn't make things worse looking at a Narnian ship when you can't get there. Well, even looking is better than nothing, said Lucy, and she is such a very Narnian ship. "Oh, still playing your old game, are you?" said Eustace Clarence, who had been listening outside the door and now came grinning into the room. Last year, when he had been staying with the Pevensies, he had managed to hear them all talking of Narnia, and he just loved teasing them about it. He thought, of course, they were making it all up, and as he was quite incapable of making anything up himself, he didn't approve of that. "You're not wanted here," said Edmund curtly. "I'm trying to think of a limerick," said Eustace. "Something like this. Some kids who played games about Narnia got gradually balmier and balmier." That means sort of nuttier and nuttier. "Well, Narnia and balmier don't rhyme to begin with," said Lucy. "It's an assonance," said Eustace. "Don't ask him what an assy thing Gummy is," said Edmund. "He's only longing to be asked. Say nothing and maybe he'll go away." Now, most boys, on having a reception like this, would either have cleared out or gotten angry. Eustace did neither. He just hung about, grinning, and presently began talking again. "Do you like that picture?" he asked. "For heaven's sake, don't let him get started about art and all that," said Edmund hurriedly, but Lucy, who was very truthful, had already said, "Yes, I do. I like it very much." "It's a rotten picture," said Eustace. "Well, you won't see it if you step outside," said Edmund. "Why do you like it?" said Eustace to Lucy. "Well, for one thing," said Lucy, "I like it because the ship looks as if it was really moving, and the water looks as if it was really wet, and the waves look as if they were really going up and down." Remember the picture of this ship? I wonder if that's like the picture they're looking at. It's not exactly it, but it might be that ship. Of course, Eustace knew lots of answers to this, but he didn't say anything. The reason was that at that very moment, he looked at the waves and saw that they did very much indeed look like they were moving. They looked like they were going up and down. He had only once been in a ship, and then only as far as the Isle of Wight, and he'd been horribly seasick. The look of the waves in the picture made him feel sick again. He turned rather green and tried to look again, and then all 3 children were staring with open mouths. What they were seeing might be hard to believe when you read it in print like this, but it was almost as hard to believe when you saw it happening. The thing is, the things in the picture were moving. It didn't look at all like a cinema picture either. The colors, like a movie or something, or on TV, the colors were too real and clean and kind of out of doors for that. Down went the prow of the ship into the wave, and up went a great shock of spray, and then up went the wave behind her, and her stern and her deck became visible for the first time, and then disappeared as the next wave came to meet her, and her bows went up again. At the same moment, an exercise book, which had been lying beside Edmund on the bed, flapped, rose, and sailed through the air to the wall behind them. And Lucy felt all her hair whipping around her face as it does on a windy day. And this was a windy day where the ship was. But the wind was blowing out of the picture towards them, and suddenly, with the wind, came the noises, the swishing of waves and the slap of water against the ship's sides, and the creaking and the overall high, steady roar of air and water. But it was the smell, the wild, briny smell, which really convinced Lucy that she was not dreaming. Have you ever smelled the ocean? It has a very unique smell, and that's what she was smelling. "Stop it," came Eustace's voice, squeaky with fright and bad temper. "It's just some silly trick you two are playing. Stop it. I'll tell Alberta and ow!" The other two were much more accustomed to adventures, but just exactly as Eustace Clarence said ow, they both said ow as well. The reason was that a great cold salt splash of water had broken right out of the frame, and they were breathless from the smack of the cold salt water, besides being wet through now. "I will smash that rotten thing," cried Eustace, and then several things happened at the same time. Eustace rushed towards the picture. Edmund, who knew something about magic, sprang after him, warning him to look out and not be foolish. Lucy grabbed at him from the other side and was dragged forward, and by this time either they had grown much smaller or the picture had grown much bigger, but at any rate Eustace jumped to try and pull it off the wall and found himself standing on the frame. In front of him was not glass, but the real ocean. And wind and waves rushed up to the frame as they might to a rock, and he lost his head and clutched at the other two who had jumped up beside him. There was a second or two of struggling and shouting, and just as they thought they had got their balance, a great blue roller, that's what they call a great big wave, a great blue roller surged up around them, swept them off their feet, and drew them down into the sea. Eustace's despairing cry suddenly ended as the water got into his mouth. Lucy thanked her stars that she had worked hard at her swimming last summer term. It is true that she would have got on much better if she had used a slower stroke, and also that the water felt a great deal colder than it had looked when it was still only in a picture. Still, she kept her head and kicked her shoes off, as everyone ought to do who falls into deep water when they're wearing their clothes. She even kept her mouth shut and her eyes open. They were still quite near the ship. She saw its green side towering high above them, and people looking at her from the deck. Then, as one might have expected, Eustace clutched at her in a panic, and down they both went. When they came up again, she saw a white figure diving off the ship's side. Edmund was close beside her now, treading water, and had caught the arms of the howling Eustace. Then someone else, whose face was vaguely familiar, slipped an arm under her from the other side. There was a lot of shouting going on from the ship, heads crowding together above the bulwarks, ropes being thrown. Edmund and the stranger were fastening ropes around her, and after that, what seemed a very long delay, during which her face got blue and her teeth began chattering. In reality, the delay was not very long. They were waiting until the moment when she could be got up on the board the ship without being smashed against the side of it with the waves. Even with all their best endeavors, she had a bruised knee when she finally stood, dripping and shivering on the deck. After her, Edmund was heaved up, and then the miserable Eustace. Last of all came the stranger who had dove off the side of the boat, a golden-headed boy some years older than herself. "Caspian!" gasped Lucy as soon as she had breath enough, for Caspian it was. And if you've been with us for book 2, you will remember Caspian a lot. Caspian, the boy king of Narnia, whom they had helped to set on the throne during their last visit. Immediately Edmund recognized him too. All three shook hands and clapped one another on the back with great delight. "But who is your friend?" asked Caspian almost at once, turning to Eustace with his cheerful smile. But Eustace was crying much harder than any boy of his age ought to cry when nothing worse than getting wet has happened to him, and he would only yell out, Let me go back, I don't like it here." Let you go, said Caspian. "But where do you want to go?" Eustace rushed to the ship's side as if he expected to see the picture frame hanging above the sea, and perhaps he might see a glimpse of Lucy's bedroom is what he hoped to see. What he saw was blue waves, flecked with foam, and pale blue sky, both spreading without a break all the way as far as he could see to the horizon. Now, perhaps we can hardly blame him if his heart sank. He was promptly sick. "Hey, Reinalf," said Caspian to one of the sailors, "please bring some spiced wine for their majesties. You'll need something to warm you up after that dip." He called Edmund and Lucy their majesties because they and Peter and Susan had all been kings and queens of Narnia long before his time. Narnian time, if you remember, flows differently from ours. If you spent 100 years in Narnia, you would still come back to our world at the very same hour of the very same day on which you left. And then, if you went back to Narnia after, say, spending a week here, you might find that 1,000 Narnian years had passed, or only a day, or no time at all. You never knew till you got there. Consequently, when the Pevensie children had returned to Narnia last time for their second visit, it was, for the Narnians, as if King Arthur came back to Britain, as some people say he will, and I will say the sooner the better. Rhinalf returned with the spiced wine steaming in a flagon and 4 silver cups. It was just what one wanted, and as Lucy and Edmund sipped it, they could feel the warmth going right down to their toes. But Eustace made faces when he tasted it and spluttered and spat it out, and he was sick again and began to cry again. And then he asked if they hadn't any Plumtree's vitaminized nerve food, and could it be made with distilled water. And anyway, he insisted on being put ashore at the next station. Thank you very much. Well, this is one merry shipmate you brought us, brother, whispered Caspian to Edmund with a chuckle, but before he could say anything more, Eustace broke out again. Oh, what on earth is that? Take it away, the horrid thing. He really had some excuse this time for feeling a little surprised. Something very curious indeed had come out of the cabin in the poop deck and was slowly approaching them. You might call it, and indeed it was, a mouse. But then it was a mouse on its hind legs and stood about 2 feet high. A thin band of gold passed around its head under one ear and over the other, and in this was stuck a long crimson feather. As the mouse's fur was very dark, almost black, the effect was bold and striking. Its paw rested on the hilt of a sword very nearly as long as its tail. Its balance, as it paced gravely along the swaying deck, was perfect. And its manners were courtly, very regal, very official. Lucy and Edmund recognized it at once. It was Reepicheep, the most valiant of all the talking beasts of Narnia, and he was the chief mouse. It had won undying glory in the second battle of Baruna. Lucy longed, as she had always done, to take Reepicheep up in her arms and cuddle him, but this, she well knew, was a pleasure she would never have. It would have offended him deeply. Instead, she went down on one knee to talk to him. Reepicheep put forward his left leg, drew back his right, bowed, kissed her hand, straightened himself, twirled his whiskers, and said in a shrill, piping voice, "My humble duty to your majesty, and to King Edmund, too." Here he bowed again. "Nothing except your majesty's presence was lacking in this glorious venture we are on." "Ah, take it away," wailed Eustace. "I hate mice, and I never could bear performing animals. They're silly and vulgar and sentimental." "Am I to understand," said Reepicheep to Lucy after a long stare at Eustace, "that this singularly discourteous person is under your majesty's protection? Because if not—" At this moment Lucy and Edmund both sneezed. "What a fool I am to keep you all standing here in your wet things," said Caspian. "Come on below and get changed. I'll give you my cabin, of course, Lucy, but I'm afraid we have no women's clothes on board. You'll have to make do with some of mine. Please lead the way, Reepicheep, like a good fellow." "To the convenience of a lady," said Reepicheep. "Even a question of honor must give way, at least for the moment." And here he looked very hard at Eustace. But Caspian hustled them on, and in a few minutes Lucy found herself passing through the door into the stern cabin. She fell in love with it at once. The 3 square windows that looked out on the blue, swirling water astern, that means at the back of them, the low cushioned benches round 3 sides of the table, the swinging silver lamp overhead. It was dwarf's work, she knew at once by its exquisite delicacy, and the flat gold image of Aslan the lion on the forward wall above the door. All of this she took in at a flash. For Caspian immediately opened a door on the starboard side and said, "This'll be your room, Lucy. I'll just get some dry things out of here for myself." He was rummaging in one of the lockers while he spoke, and then I'll leave you to change. If you fling your wet things outside the door, I'll have them taken to the galley to be dried. Lucy found herself as much at home as if she had been in Caspian's cabin for weeks. And the motion of the ship didn't worry her at all, for in the old days when she had been a queen in Narnia, she had done a good deal of voyaging on ships. The cabin was very tiny, as they are on boats, but bright with painted panels, all birds and beasts and crimson dragons and vines, and spotlessly clean. Caspian's clothes were too big for her, but she thought she could manage. His shoes, sandals, and sea boots were hopelessly large, but she didn't mind going barefoot on board the ship. When she had finished dressing, she looked out of her window at the water rushing past and took a long, deep breath. She felt quite sure they were in for a lovely time. That's the end of the picture in the bedroom. Chapter 2, you make sure you come back for that. It's called On Board the Dawn Treasure.